This is really the conclusion of the practical portion of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. What follows in verse 10 and then down through the rest of the letter is more like an epilogue with two parts to it. One part is the concern and the warnings about our spiritual enemy and how to fight against the spiritual darkness that is always surrounding us. And then the final piece is then Paul the apostle, closing with some words that he often does at the end of his letters. Just to give you a heads up as to where we are then going in our Sunday plan is I'll be finishing this text, this section here, and then the next 2 weeks we'll be back in Proverbs, and then following that we'll come back to Ephesians 6 and finish out the letter. This text is very interesting. One, in translation, and most translations do this same thing, though there's some variety. The word bondservants or servants or slaves, depending on which translation you're reading, is all the same word throughout the text, even if it changes throughout in the different translations, all the same word whenever that's used. It is the more common word, doulos or slave. And it needs to be understood that when Paul is writing this, when he uses the word slave, he's writing to literal slaves. He's writing to people who are considered mere possessions. They're nothing more than a two-legged donkey to a lot of people. So this is a tough text. One, it's difficult because our immediate reaction often in reading this is to jump into our application, and we don't let it sit long enough that Paul is writing to Christian slaves. Something that's so foreign to our thinking. Yes, the idea of slavery is in our history, but and there is much slavery that is still present all over the world, and even here in different kinds of slavery. But we just generally do not live in this environment, in this Western civilization. We all freely chose to come here today, and no one hindered us. And so we need to think and sit a little bit in the context if you were reading this in the first century, before we rush to applying it to our own lives. We need to think a little bit about that. So before we even get into the text, what did it mean to be a slave in Ephesus in the first century or second century? It kind of lasted for a few hundred years here. What did it mean? Well, first, there's a couple of historical notes that might be helpful. One is that racial or ethnic prejudice played no part in the slavery in ancient Rome. Nothing to do with race or ethnicity. That's not what made someone a slave. Yet it still was a cruel and dehumanizing practice. Slaves were either conquered peoples, criminals, poor individuals who sold themselves into slavery or were sold into slavery, perhaps a son or a daughter who were sold into slavery because the parents were poor and they couldn't afford to take care of their own children. Or if you were born into a family of slaves, you were a slave as well. That's how one was a slave in the first century. It's estimated that around 30% of the population of Rome were slaves. Slaves were then the engine room of the powerful Roman Empire and economy. There was no limit vocationally on who could be a slave. Educated people that were slaves were doctors and accountants and shopkeepers and poets and artists. That was much better life if you were an educated slave. Uneducated slaves, probably the most dangerous, were like miners who worked in the mines, prostitutes, launderers. Other jobs often ended in severe illness, and usually you never gained any freedom. You died in your job. To keep slaves from rebelling, which happened more often than one might expect, owners often used the carrot and the stick sort of perception. a carrot, they'd pay them a little bit of money. They could, not always. And with that money, a person could save up, and over decades, they could purchase their freedom. The other way was the stick, quite literally. It was perfectly lawful to beat your slaves if they did not do what you wanted, even to kill them if they didn't do what you wanted. Slave owners were required to provide food and shelter legally, but there's very little evidence that that was policed. Abuse was rampant. Even educated slaves had no civic rights, no way to redress grievances. They were property and at times considered equal to service animals. Doesn't mean that this was accepted by everyone, especially the slaves. They didn't like it very much. But there were others as well. Philosophers argued against slavery. Stoics particularly argued against the inhumane practice of slavery. But even in the most ardent anti-slavery literature, the idea of abolition was not really brought up. There was no thought in their mind. That would be like talking to somebody in that era. If somebody says, well, why didn't anybody say, why don't we abolish the slavery? That'd be like talking to someone then and saying, well, why don't you just drive your car? They'd be like, the what? I don't even understand what you're talking about. And that's the way the economy and the culture worked. They didn't understand this concept. Well, you can't abolish it. You just treat them well. However, there were some people who spoke out for abolition and wrote abolition-type documents. Those were Christians. Christians spoke out. They advocated for abolition. Where Christianity began to thrive, slavery began to die. Texts like this one actually become a sort of abolition document that Christians used, as well as others like Jesus' own words about doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, and Philemon, the letter Paul wrote to Philemon, where he basically says, free your slave, Philemon, you're a Christian. But we have to understand when Paul is writing to slaves, he's writing into a culture where this was normative. It would be weird for Paul to not address the issue. He's addressed husbands, he's addressed wives, he's addressed fathers, he's addressed children. Christians, many of them were slaves because they were poor. It would be weird for him not to address the predominant vocation of the people that were reading this letter. And so he addresses slaves and masters or lords. Says a lot more to the slaves than he does the masters, perhaps because there were far more slaves than Christian masters. So this is how he begins. The text is really easily divided into two sections, verse 5 through 7, and then verse 9, to the slaves and to the masters. Bondservants, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. As I said before, most Christians were slaves of some sort in the first century. Majority of readers resonate more with the first part of this text than the second, I am sure. When you look at the text, the word masters there is one translation. The word is actually the plural of lords or kurios, the same word for Christ, the Lord. And every time you see this word or the word Lord in here, it's the same word. So he actually does a play on words in this text. He says, slaves, be obedient to your lesser lords because there is the Lord. And that's how he sort of does that. It kind of misses a little bit in translation, but that's what's going on in the text. The command is clear and simple, though at first glance feels unfair and impossible. Slaves, obey the lesser lords. It's a bit provocative to call them to obey those who are perhaps unjust toward them, cruel, dehumanizing. What is even more provocative is what he does at the end of verse 5 and 6. And in verse 5 and 6, he describes the type of obedience that he expects or that God expects. And he says this kind of obedience to your lesser lords, obedience that is characterized by fear and trembling. Now, this is metaphoric. This is not saying, they're literally shaking physically while they're doing their job as a slave. This phrase together, fear and trembling, is a metaphor for humility. With humility. Obey them with a humble heart. He says also in sincerity of heart, or that literally means with generosity, openness. The word sincerity is like an open-hearted humility. So not only is he telling them to obey their slaves, obey their masters, the slaves to obey their masters, Christian slaves, but he's saying, and do so with an openness, with generosity. It's a little bit similar to Jesus talking about if one compels you to go a mile, go two. If one slaps you on the cheek, turn the other one. If someone takes your coat, give him your cloak too. This openness, even in the face of injustice. That's what he's describing here. Now, I know that he's referring not to the actions. I don't think he is saying, and I'm pretty confident he's not saying, be generous necessarily with your work or your service of your hands, though I think that flows down from this. But because in the text he uses this phrase, in generosity of heart. So he's referring to the inner attitude, the heart of the obedience. And every parent who has ever told their child to obey, and children, you're not slaves, don't worry, I'm not saying that this morning, but every parent who's ever told their child to obey understands that the obedience is not just what they do, but what they do in here, right? The generosity of heart, sincerity of heart, simplicity of heart, openness in heart. So I can just hear a slave say, wait, you mean God wants us not just to obey, but he wants us to actually like have the right attitude, have an open attitude, a generous attitude in our obedience? He says, yes, well, that's impossible. How could that be? I can't do that. You don't know my master. He says, oh, no, listen. As to Christ. So forget who he is, who she is, and consider who he is. And now, open your heart in this really unfair situation. He then continues to describe more of the attitude, the proper attitude of obedience. He says, not, and he's using a positive or negative positive, not with eye service as men pleasers. Those two words, eye service and men pleasers, these two words are not found anywhere else in the Greek language, so Paul made them up. They're essentially exactly what they sound like not with serving because it's seen or because there's watching, but as slaves, and he says it again, of Christ. Doing the will of God from the heart, and that word heart, there's literally soul service, inner being. Soul obedience. Okay, that's pretty steep. I mean, I wish you would have just said, all right, every now and then throw him a bone and do something nice for your master. But this is wholehearted, inner soul, devotion to the will of God that causes me, even in a situation like this, to serve them. That's what he's describing here. Now, notice, once again, in every one of these relationships that we've seen, right? Husbands, wives, children, parents, there's that little phrase limiting or expressing like the limits of such obedience or the limits of submission or the limits of love, all these things. There's a limit here, right? Did you catch the limit here in the text? He says, doing the will of God in your soul. You're not to obey that master in ways in which he contradicts morality and righteousness. So it's not obey them in whatever they say. It's obey them, but don't allow your obedience to them undermine your obedience to God. Do the will of God. This is a constant Christian theme, isn't it, throughout the Bible? The book of Acts, We ought to obey God rather than men, no matter what it costs us. It's a constant Christian thing. We have one Lord, one Master. Obedience to him triumphs and trumps over every other obedience on earth. That's the heart of service. That's the action that he has here. But now he describes the manner of that action. With goodwill, doing service. So internal, obedience in the heart that is humble, open, and devoted to Christ. That's what he describes first. Internal obedience that is humble, open, devoted to Christ. And then he says, now externally, what does that look like? Doing. What do you do then? Whether it's you're washing or you're selling or you're cleaning or whatever it is the slave is to do, what you're doing, he says, with goodwill doing service. And this is a little bit of a strange phrase, but it essentially means doing good, pleasured service. So doing a good job is essentially what that means. Doing good, pleasured service. So it is, maybe this is a little extreme, but it is like, and don't spit in his food. Do good service. I'm not going to clean that up, sort of thing. Just do good service. But once again, he keeps adding these little phrases, as to the Lord, and not to men, not as men pleasers, not with eye service, not to men. Now, could you imagine the sort of reverberations that this would look like in the world where oppression of slaves was normative, and not only normative and expected, but actually the way to get your way up in standing? How many slaves do you have? Oh, how many do you have? Well, how often do you have to beat yours? You imagine this sort of conversation around the bathhouses or whatever going on in Rome, in Ephesus. But could you imagine, let's just say, his name is Junia. Pludius remarks to Junia and says, man, you know what? I noticed that your slave, he's always on time. He does what he's supposed to do. How much do you have to beat him to get that? And Junia goes, you know what's crazy? I don't even beat him. Okay, you must pay him a lot then. I probably should, but I don't. Why does he do that? I don't know. He does ask for one thing. He does ask for an hour on the first day to go with his Christian cult. But hey, I give it to him because he gives me so much other time. He does goodwill service. Could you imagine that reverberation down the line of that? And then maybe perhaps one day Junia approaches his nameless slave, says, why are you such a better slave than the rest of my property? I never even have to hit you once this week. With fear and trembling, the Christian responds, my Lord, I know a secret. You know a secret? I know a secret. Well, what's the secret? The good I do in service to you, I will receive the same, perhaps even more, from my one true master in the life to come. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. And my master in heaven, he doesn't care that I'm a slave. And he doesn't care that you're free. Now, I have no idea how Junia might respond to that. Bravo, old move, Christian. But that's what Paul is saying. You know this. You have this secret knowledge that they don't have. You know something that they're missing. And what you know that they don't get is that this life is but a dot. And there is a line of eternity that extends far beyond that dot. And eternity matters most. That's what you know. I believe that to the degree that one loves and serves the Lord now impacts the degree to which one loves his Lord in eternity. I don't understand all that the Scripture has to say about eternal rewards. I'm not talking about salvation or eternal life and heaven. I'm talking about, the Bible talks about rewards or levels of reward in eternity, and I don't understand all of that. But there is some sort of continuity between this life and the life to come. There is some kind of love in this life that only increases from there in the life to come. Perhaps this illustration might help. So I love my wife dearly. I think about her throughout the day. I consider her kindness and beauty while I'm away from her. And if that is happening throughout the day, will not my reward be greater to me when I see her and embrace her at the end of the day? Now, I'm not saying, will not her perspective of me be greater, but will not my perspective of her be greater when I see her at the end of the day? Because I have lived for her throughout the day. And is not the flip side true? If I selfishly think little of her, shamefully refuse to speak of her, regard her lightly, think only of myself throughout the day, what sort of internal reward do I expect to experience when I see her at the end of the day? Oh yeah, there you are. Forgot you existed today. And will not that evening when we dine and talk be less sweet than if I had experienced her love all day long? Christian, I believe that this is what the New Testament means when it speaks of levels of reward for the believer. It's not that God's view of the believer changes throughout the day or throughout life, or God's perspective or regard for the Christian is a fluctuating or an increasing or decreasing thing based upon anything we do. God's perspective of the Christian is set in his perspective on Jesus Christ. His perspective and his view of the Christian is satisfied, and this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, on Jesus. But what about our perspective of him? Does that not change? Does that not increase or decrease throughout life? Perhaps that is what Paul means when he speaks about those who are saved yet as by fire, and they suffer loss when they enter eternity. Yet they're still there, they're saved, but they lost. But those who have gold, silver, precious stone, there is in their heart, Christ is gold and silver and precious stone to them. Perhaps that's what he's talking about in Corinthians when he speaks of that sort of reward or the level. Perhaps it's not about stuff like the pastor gets 2 Lamborghinis in a bigger house or something dumb like that. Perhaps it's about our own heart, our own affections, that the degree in which we progress and increase in this life only continues to skyrocket in the life to come. So there is continuity. It does matter in this life because eternity matters most. Heaven does not erase who we are, nor does it erase what we've done in true service. It only amplifies it. Bottom line, I simply believe some people will enjoy heaven a lot more than others. Not because God enjoys them more, but because they will enjoy him so much more. As he moves to the masters, the Christian masters, he makes an interesting statement. He has an action, just like he did with the slaves. The action to the slaves is be obedient to your masters. To the masters, to the lesser lords, do the same things to them. Rule them in the same way. Now wait, the same things. What possibly could he mean by same things? Does he mean, okay, masters, obey your slaves? That doesn't make any sense, right? No, the same things that he's referring to is the heart and soul attitude. Do the same things or have the same heart and soul. He's talking to Christians here. In other words, if a slave is to obey with fear and trembling, with humility, with openness of heart, as to Christ, doing the will of God, devoted 100% to Christ and not to his master, not caring what others see or what pleases men. So the masters, so the lords must lead, rule with fear and trembling, with humility, with openness and generosity of heart to their slaves, as to Christ. Not caring whether the Roman colleagues think they're softies or whatever. Who cares about pleasing them because you're a Christian? So you do the will of God from your heart. It's kind of like equalizing slave and master here, right? In the heart. Even if their position is distinct, their heart must be the same. Now, how could that be that he would say, do the same thing or have the same heart, the same soul toward your slaves as the slaves to the masters? Well, the reason why is when you think about those three things that this is describing: humility, generosity of heart, and devoted to the will of God, gentle and lowly and doing the Father's will. Doesn't that sound like someone? Doesn't that sound like Jesus? So what he is saying here is, slaves, be like Jesus to your masters. Masters, be like Jesus to your slaves. And someone would say, well, that sounds crazy. How is a master supposed to be like Jesus to his slave? I mean, that sounds like he'd probably free him or something. It's a great idea. Perhaps the golden rule: do unto others, like Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Perhaps a man who has slaves becomes a Christian and he's reads about Jesus, and Jesus is saying, hey, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay, that applies to everyone. Doesn't even say which one. Well, if I were a slave, I would sure not want to be a slave. Okay, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's why the New Testament, where Christianity thrives, slavery died, because it's an abolitionist document. It's one that opposes this sort of thing. Perhaps not with legislation, which would be completely unheard of and unrecognizable, perhaps even dangerous when 30% of the people would suddenly be unemployed. The poorest people no longer have any shelter or anything. But by changing the heart, by redeeming the heart, the culture is changed. That's what Paul gets at in Philemon when he's writing, and he tells Philemon, take back your runaway slave Onesimus. And then Paul reminds Philemon, oh, and by the way, just remember how much I have been so generous to you when you take him back. Have that generosity toward him. And then he kind of concludes it all with, and you know what? Don't receive him as a slave. Receive him as a brother. Well, how do you receive one as a brother? You free them, and you pay them, and they become your employee rather than your property. All through the New Testament, there's these examples of how Christianity worked toward the end of slavery in the Roman Empire. Now, that's not to say that people don't abuse and twist the Scripture to continue this sort of practice. So that's the attitude of the master. Same attitude, same heart, which I think leads toward the slave becoming an employee. But what's the action? How is he supposed to treat him, then, the one under his employment? If the slave is to do good service, the master is called to give up threatening. Now, at first, when you're reading this, at least when I was reading this, I said, well, that's setting the bar kind of low. So don't threaten them. Why does he pick out this problem of threatening them? Well, this also helps to get a little bit more insight into Roman slavery. I read a little bit of history this week regarding this, and it was very interesting to me that slave revolts were very common. There was I don't remember exactly who it was. It's some senator. There was a senator, and they had proposed a legislation or a law that would require all the slaves to wear the same clothes. So there would be a marker so that everybody could see who was a slave and who was not a slave. And that legislation, they tried it, and then they quickly rescinded it because they were afraid, wait, if all these slaves can easily identify each other as slaves, you know what's going to happen? The ants are going to rise up against the grasshoppers. Right? They're going to revolt. They're going to see their numbers, and they are going to kill us. So they said, no, never mind. Slaves all have to wear different kinds of clothes so they can't identify each other. There was this constant fear of revolts. So the way they put this down, the cultural, the normative, it's just the way you did business, was you threatened. I'm going to sell your kids. I'm going to beat you. You don't do what I want, you're done. So this isn't a low bar. This is Paul, the apostle, under the inspiration of the Spirit, saying to the Christians, don't even do the minimal harm to your slave. Let alone beat them, sell them, mistreat them. Don't even say it to them. Don't even let the words, I'm going to, come out of your mouth. So this is actually, I believe, not the only thing, the only responsibility of Christian masters, but Paul is highlighting this one because this one is culturally significant. This is the one that you could just hear a Christian, a slave owner who becomes a Christian going, but what am I going to do? When they don't threaten them. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Don't threaten them. Well, that's so, hey, you know a secret too. In fact, it's the same secret. You know something too. That you may be in this culture a master, but you are not in the next. You have a master. You have a Lord. He's in heaven. And just like he doesn't care to the slave whether he's slave or free, there's no partiality with him either. He doesn't care that you're a master. So this statement is kind of like both of these. It's the same thing, the knowing, it's the same thing. It's kind of like one statement with two different tones. So, like, what do I mean? What does my wife mean when she says, just wait till your dad gets home? Well, that depends, right, on the tone. Because there's two ways to say that. Just wait till your dad gets home. Or just wait till your dad gets home. And that's kind of what's happening here to the slaves. Just wait till you get home. Just wait till you get to your master. He doesn't care whether you're slave or free. And to the slave owner, just wait till you get to your master. He doesn't care whether you're master or slave. But yet, the spiritual truth that bridges slave and free, the spiritual truth that bridges slave and free, whether we're in this same sort of situation, and we're not, is true for us today. Just wait till you get home. Just wait. Paul's clear and repeated principle is that whatever circumstances, whatever situation a believer finds themselves in now, desirable or horrible, the reality of eternity matters most. To the unbeliever, to the questioner, to the wanderer today, may I just make a point of application that may sound like the second tone rather than the first. So many people live their lives trying to get out of bad situations, trying to better their status, wealth, power, and authority. Yet small and great, rich and poor, somebodies and nobodies, every one of us must face this inescapable reality. We are walking dead men. No one escapes Father Time's cruelty. No one cheats death. As the author of Hebrews says, it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this, judgment. As I said earlier, our lives, we are like a dot, a period on a page with a long, unending line after it. That dot is now. The unending line is eternity. And the question is not primarily, what does your now look like? What will your eternity look like? To put it in the very simple evangelistic term, where will you go when you die? Who will you meet when you die? And will you have joy when you meet him, or terror? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And what he meant by that is not just that no one sees the Father, but no one sees the Father. No one comes to the Father with joy except through me, because all will see the Father. If you die and meet God without the righteous presence of Jesus Christ, holy God in the Scripture says that you will rightly and fairly suffer for your own sins infinitely and eternally in God's fiery sea of judgment. Yet, if anyone, slave or free, rich or poor, young or old, smart or dumb, receive the righteous life of Christ and death on the cross as their judgment, as their fiery lake, then you will enter the next life and the forever that follows, redeemed, forgiven, absolved, whole, free forever. Infinitely, eternally, with the righteousness of Jesus Christ as your own. My friend, do not delay. The dot is short. The dot is precise. The dot is decreed by a sovereign God. Tomorrow is not guaranteed to us. Rest your eternal hopes fully and solely on Jesus Christ for the sake of the line, for the sake of the joy that is promised, and the increasing delight that will be yours. Yet, believer, one who has rested their hope in Jesus, that's as simple as it is. Rest your soul in Jesus. And those who have rested their soul in Jesus, just wait till you get home. The eternal weight of glory is nothing. It's everything compared to the heaviest weight of affliction in this life. The eternal weight of glory is everything compared to the heaviest weight of affliction in this life. There is a second application need to make. And that's, well, but what about the dot? What about living now? And how do we apply this text now? Well, we don't have the same situation as slavery in this regard. But if we're talking about lesser lords, right, we have that. Your boss is your lesser lord, right? Your teacher at school is your lesser lord. The civic authorities are your lesser lords, right? These are the masters that he's talking about here. So what do we do as those who love and honor our King, as to Christ, for Christ, doing the will of God, to the Lord? Like all these phrases, what do we do? Well, it's simple. obey with humility, generosity, and openness with your time and service, not caring primarily that they're watching, but with joy that He's watching. Knowing that even the mundane things of life you do on Monday have an eternal continuity effect. I mean, that helps, right? Whatever you face tomorrow, eternity's part of that. What if you are the Lord, the lesser Lord? Well, humility, generosity, not caring about what the culture says, but doing the will of God. And govern and rule and teach and lead without threats, but without partiality, knowing that your God is not partial either. You're not somebody to God because you're somebody here. So don't rule the company that way. Humility. Whatever the case, Christian, whether you find yourself in a good or bad circumstance, one you can change and one you cannot, simply leave this word for you. Beloved, live today, even in the mundane situations of life, in such a way that will bring you great joy in eternity. Will bring great glory to Christ your King.